Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, now President of Realising Rights.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you again for doing this video. You have done so much work on 1325 and on peace and conflict resolution. Could you just say a couple of words on what do you think is the best way of involving women in peacekeeping?
I believe it's extraordinarily important that women have the role in peacekeeping that will make peace come about much more effectively. First of all, to listen to women on the ground. They are not passive victims. They are actually coping with conflict, keeping their families together, keeping food on the table, getting firewood, sometimes at risk of being raped so often, and they have very much the ideas of what they need. And of course, security is the most important. There mustn't be any tolerance of gender violence, of sexual violence against women. It's terrible to see, you know, UN peacekeepers, officials on the ground, knowing that there's violence and having a kind of cultural tolerance. It's been there, it's been like that. It's not acceptable. And there is no doubt that when women are involved as SRSG, Special Representatives of the Secretary-General, when women are involved in the army, in the police, when women are chief of police, as they are in countries like Liberia now, it makes a big difference. And it made a difference that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf wouldn't accept a man as the Special Representative of the Secretary-General. When I was elected President of Ireland, I was told that I would have to have 3 security people at all times. And I said, that's all right as long as one of them is a woman. And they said, well, there's no woman trained enough in firearms. And I said, well, train them. And it made a whole career path for women. That's not in a conflict situation, that was just in an ordinary modern Ireland. But all the way along, women tend to look out for other women, to want to appoint them. Women need to feel secure because there are women there. When we were in eastern Chad talking to women who had come across the border, been fled for their lives from the villages in Darfur with their families, with appalling stories that we heard of being raped and re-raped and watching their children being killed, their husbands, etc. They didn't feel safe in the camp. And when we said, you know, well, who's causing the violence? They said men in uniform or pieces of uniform, maybe just the trousers of uniform. And it didn't matter whether it was the soldiers from the government of Chad or rebel soldiers. They were equally likely to cause violence. They were far from their own home in the very large country of Chad, and women were fair game. And women are fair game in the culture unless a stand is taken and unless we have zero tolerance.
And for those women's organizations working on the ground that are trying to work with these women, what best practices would you recommend to them?
I think there are a lot of very good practices now. I do believe it's very important to record, to take the stories and to pass that along. Pass it along to the International Criminal Court, pass it along to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Make sure that the stories get out, because again, that has a lot to do with the dignity of women locally, that they can look for justice, they can look for accountability. It's also important that we use this period now until October to strengthen 1325. I have the honour to co-chair a panel that has been brought together, a civil society group with Binta Diop of Femme Africa Solidarity. And what we want is to hear the examples on the ground. So women can actually help us at the moment. And I'll say this later at this conference of the Women's Learning Partnership. Women locally can help us by feeding in their ideas, their good practices, and we will take it to the high-level steering committee of the UN, which is chaired by the Deputy Secretary-General, and hopefully we'll get a stronger whole sense of the resolution 1325 and commitments of governments to have X number of women in their police force, in their training, in their peacekeeping missions, all across the way, that women are appointed to positions of peacekeeping and peacebuilding. I saw a statistic that about 2.4% of the signatures on peace treaties are women. Somebody did a count. So what happens, and women on the ground know this too well in conflict situations, peace processes, they get a lot of television and they're nice hotels, are bad men talking to bad governments and other bad men, and they get all the attention. And it's women who are building the pieces of a peace process behind the scenes and who don't get to the table, don't get the credit and the recognition. And that has to change. And we're proposing that a quota of at least 30% in all peace negotiations has to be women. And then we'll be told, but there aren't any women trained. And you know what we'll say? They're there, we'll train them, we'll find them, they have to be at the table.
Thank you, very true. You've also worked a lot on and written a lot on poverty and violence and the connections between the two. What are the most effective ways of dealing with this intersection of poverty and violence?
Again, I think it's best for women to try to be organised, and they can be organised in groups to do with access to credit, activities together. It's that kind of solidarity together that strengthens women when there is terrible poverty and the gun around the corner and the corruption of the police and the exploitation. So the initial solidarity of women's groups, and that's why training those women's groups is so important. And what I like to bring home when I'm talking to women who are in difficult situations is what you're doing is important. Because very often women underestimate the value of getting organised, of getting a voice out, of having a way of reaching out, of coping. Even now I note, because I've been particularly aware of the impact of climate negatively. Women are sort of saying, we don't have seasons anymore, the crops are destroyed, we don't know when to sow, and yet they are coping with their families, they're putting the food on the table, they're trying to make matters better, and they are agents for changing the circumstances, and they need to understand that their voice is an important voice on any solutions. And people should not come in, as too often happens, with their ideas from the outside. They should come in and listen, and that's what Nelson Mandela said to those of us who've been invited to be elders with Archbishop Desmond Tutu as our chair, to be humble and listen, because there's a great wisdom in people knowing what the situation is, and that is very true of women in situations of violence, in situations of the kind of absolute poverty which is a form of violence. There is no dignity when you cannot put bread on the table for starving children, when you don't have medicines for a dying child. These are the kind of things that we need to understand, that women profoundly have the answers if we'll only listen as to how we make the changes in society.
Very true. And my last question to you is, as you know, it's WLP's 10th anniversary, and the partnership is comprised of organizations in 20 countries. Is there any message you'd like to give to the partnership?
I have been admiring the work of WLP over quite a number of years, and the fact that you're working in 20 countries and looking for best practices and exchanging information and giving great hope and training and visibility to women's groups in those 20 countries and drawing on and making their work known internationally it's a great achievement. You've marked now your first 10 years. All I can say is roll on the next 10 years. And I think we will see even more changes. And these next 10 years have to be the decade of women. The African Union has proclaimed the decade of the African woman. So let's make it the decade of women who are making change locally, that local may affect the national and the regional and the international.